Hello, welcome to this week's CMC Markets Currency Snapshot with myself, Jasper Lawler. We're going to be looking at cable, that's the British pound against the US dollar. At the moment, PM David Cameron is in Brussels. He's talking up a prospect of a UK deal with Europe, and since this debate has become a bit more current, a bit more topical, and since Cameron's really been again trying to get this deal hammered through, the British pound has really started to suffer. Now we've got that on one hand, but we also have changing ideas about how much the Federal Reserve can increase interest rates in the US. So both these two factors driving the British pound at the moment, we've got a fairly clear defined price range on the chart, which we're going to have a look at and see what the prospects are for a breakout. So first I want to show you just this slightly strange looking chart when you first look at it. It's a daily price chart. It's just comparing the British pound against the dollar index. The reason I'm doing this is that you can see, if we look at this chart now, there's a sort of gradually inclining price trend in the dollar index. This is happening throughout December and into the early part of January. Basically with the idea that the Fed has just raised rates, they seem to be the only one capable of doing so, and the US dollar has been going up with those prospects of higher interest rates. But if we look at the British pound, that's really crashed pretty severely. That downtrend is pretty sharp. And so I think what we can conclude from this, it is not just the US dollar driving this decline throughout December. There's something else very much British related. And I think there's a good chance that it's the Brexit debate weighing on the ability of the Bank of England to raise interest rates this year. Now, you'll have seen on that chart that after those two areas of trend that we talked about, there's been quite a sharp drop off in the US dollar, and the British pound has managed to stabilize a bit. That, to my mind, is more of a US dollar phenomenon, because bets that the Fed are able to raise rates further this year have seriously declined. The US economy is looking a little weak, and there's a lot of calls for maybe not even any more rate hikes from the Fed this year, even some talk of a rate cut, and the Federal Reserve themselves have actually been looking at negative interest rates as a possible policy tool. So the US dollar's fallen off, the British pound has stabilized. So now we're going to have a look at a longer term chart for the British pound, then a shorter term chart, just to see where we are in terms of levels and where we can work out from here. So this is a monthly chart for the British pound that we're going to look at next. You can see that the 142.30 support area has really been the big one that we've reacted from here. And you can see that even though we've popped below it, we're back up through it now, and we're sort of stabilizing. Now, if we drop down to this daily price chart, you can see a bit more specifically the price levels that are involved. The 143.50 has been quite the pivot level. We're pushed up through there, found support, we dropped through there again. Now we're right in around that area, acting as resistance. This is what's causing the price to bounce around in the time being. But really, for us to get some idea as to where the direction of the pound can be headed next, it's got to be a move through this 142.30 support to tell us that we're renewing the downtrend, or a push up through the 146.30 resistance, which was the peak from January, to tell us that actually this downtrend has ended and we're looking at more of a potential uptrend taking place. Okay, that's it for this week's CMC Markets Currency Snapshot. We were looking at the pound, of course, against the US dollar, namely. Now, we've talked about this price range. Really, whether the price can push up through the top or bottom of the range kind of depends on these two factors. It's, do expectations remain low that the Fed is going to be able to raise rates this year? If it does, that's a positive factor for the pound. Does David Cameron sign a pretty weak deal for Europe, maybe even no deal at all? That's a negative impact for the pound. To my mind, the two are kind of offsetting each other at the moment. There's uncertainty over a Bank of England rate rise. There's also uncertainty about a US rate rise. And so that sort of combined uncertainty probably means we're going to be in and around this kind of price range for a while, probably without much of a breakout in either direction. We're probably looking at range trading, which means high probability trades at the bottom of the range, high probability trades at the top of the range.
War on Want has taken a position that we're not campaigning for either an in or an out vote. We're basically trying to use the opportunity of the EU referendum to educate people on what the EU is actually about, because in our view, 99% of the people in Britain really haven't got any direct experience of the EU. Personally, myself, I have had the experience over the last 20 years of trying to change European Union policy, so I know directly how difficult it is to get any purchase on the EU institutions. So from my personal perspective, I can't see that there's any point in voting in, because we can never change Europe for the better. Voting in is just a vote for the status quo, and the status quo is not good. Well, the three main bodies of the European Union are the EU Council of Ministers, that's the heads of government of the 28 member states. They meet together and they basically form the supreme governance body. They're the ones who have the sort of supreme decision-making power. Then you've got the European Commission, and the European Commission is effectively the civil service for the European Union, but it's more than a normal civil service. It's a very powerful institution. It has this thing called the right of initiative, which means it can launch legislation, it can decide what Europe is actually going to do. And also, of course, it's not transparent, it's not accountable, and it's not elected, despite the fact that it has all this power. And then the third body is the European Parliament. The European Parliament is the elected body. It's the MEPs that we return every 5 years to Brussels, to Strasbourg. But the problem is, of course, that they have very little power. The most democratic bits of the European Union are the most powerless bits, and that's part of the problem. We know that voting to come out of the European Union doesn't solve all of our problems by any means. We know that the government in Britain is the most right-wing of any of the European Union member states, and therefore we're just going to come out of the frying pan into the fire. The difference is that at least in Britain there is at least some democratic channel through which we can challenge our government, and that's the problem about the European Union. There is a massive democratic deficit, and this is particularly worrying now since the Treaty of Lisbon came in 2009. There's been an explicit understanding that member states have to take second place to the European Union, and that's why last year in Greece, for example, when the Greek people said we want an alternative, we don't want to have to put up with the austerity program imposed from the centre of the European Union, they were told explicitly by Jean-Claude Juncker, the President of the European Commission, there can be no choice against the European treaties. And the European treaties, particularly the Lisbon Treaty, says that you, as ordinary members of your own national bodies, cannot question the line that's been taken at the centre. The only thing that it allows for individual countries to do is to withdraw from the European Union. And that's the problem. There is this democratic problem right at the heart of Europe, which can only be solved according to the official rules by leaving. So at the moment, all of the trade and investment policies of the European Union go through Brussels. That's one of the things which came in through the Treaty of Lisbon in 2009. We don't have a national trade or investment policy. So if we come out of the EU, then we will regain control over our own trade and investment policies. Yes, obviously, that when we're members of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, we will be bound by the rules that the WTO puts down. And unfortunately, a lot of those rules are simply in favor of big business and against the interests of ordinary people. But we, at least as the UK, will be able to have a decision as to whether or not we abide by those rules and what position we take vis-à-vis the broader trading blocs and the bilateral groups. If you're in the European Union, we don't have any control over that. That goes through Brussels. It's quite clear that if you want to tackle global problems, you've got to do it together with other nations. That's completely obvious. But the idea of being in the European Union is not just some sort of fuzzy idea of doing things with others. It's a particular set of institutions which are following a particular set of rules and policies which at the moment are directed solely towards the interests of big business, transnational capital, and against the interests of the environment, people, society. And I think that if people feel that somehow just being part of a big club is the answer, they're not really paying attention to the problem. The European Union has adopted policies which are completely counter to the fight against climate change. So the key thing in the European Union is not that it's just the sum of its parts. You could think that perhaps if you had a whole lot of progressive governments, then they could change the direction of the EU. But actually the point about the treaties of the European Union is that it locks us into a predetermined path. And that path is a path which has been developed by capital for capital. It's not in favour of people or the planet. It's specifically for big business. And so there is no democratic choice that can shift the European Union from its current path.